Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 594, Koume's World, Part 1. One of the fun things about doing this podcast for such a long time is that once you discover one interesting resource, it can lead you to all kinds of cool places. You might recall a few years back, I did a two-parter based on Dr. Amy Stanley's book Stranger in the Shogun City. That's episodes 456 and 457 specifically. That book is the reconstruction of the life of a peasant woman named Tsuneno during the early to mid-1800s based on her correspondence with her family. It's a well-written book both because Dr. Stanley herself is an excellent researcher and writer, and because the book does something that until pretty recently was relatively rare in scholarship on Japanese history, especially English language scholarship. You see, for a very long time, history focused on women, their lives, their experiences, their contribution to Japanese and world history was pretty thin on the ground for a couple of reasons. First, of course, there's good old-fashioned misogyny, the assumption that women's history is, for whatever reason, unimportant or not interesting, despite the fact that it kind of definitionally deals with, half of the human experience or whatever. Second, particularly when talking about pre-modern Japan, there are some pretty specific challenges to doing women's history. Though there are many women whose lives are well documented in the pre-modern era, in many cases women's lives remain pretty challenging for modern historians to discuss. You see, the notion that women were entirely private figures, that their lives were not meant to be discussed in public, had some currency throughout pre-modern Japanese history, particularly in later years as the intensely patriarchal political philosophy known as Neo-Confucianism started to develop a following among Japan's elite. As a result, written records about women's lives were just thin on the ground. To the extent they existed in the first place, they often were not preserved for modern scholars either. And that meant that modern historians who wanted to work on this subject were, and still are, limited by a real paucity of sources. Even Stranger in the Shogun City is full of moments where Dr. Stanley has to make inferences about the life of her main character, so to speak, because other than the letters, there's just not much to work with. So the availability of sources makes this a hard field to work in, but the cool thing is that like any field of history, or really academia in general, once you find one interesting piece of work, one scholar doing something that you think is pretty neat, you can find others whose work they reference or speak well of, and it was through Dr. Stanley I came across the work of Dr. Simon Partner, whose own book, Koume's World, does some very similar things to Stranger in the Shogun City, while also doing a couple of things very differently. You see, Dr. Partner wrote a book about someone pretty different from the fairly unknown commoner Tsuneno. His book is based on a diary kept by a woman from the samurai class, Kawai Koume, who lived through one of the most turbulent and fascinating periods of Japanese history, the Meiji Restoration and its aftermath. Koume's World is great for a lot of the same reasons Stranger in the Shogun City is great. It's a look into daily life, how people actually lived, a chance to view history through the lens of someone other than the big names you tend to find in a textbook. But Koume's World is fascinating for one other reason too. In his introduction, Dr. Partner writes in what I think is a very moving way about what we tend to imagine it's like to live through a big historical event. We tend to view those events in a very textbook way, from this very zoomed-out perspective. Big battles, political clashes, grand triumphs, tragedies, all that stuff. It's fascinating and it's interesting, but it's not how most people live through interesting times. I remember asking my own grandmother about what she remembered from World War I when she was a young girl and World War II when she was a married adult, and being kind of disappointed at the tender age of 8 or whatever it was, to realize it was mostly just daily life. She remembered rationing, the occasional rally to buy war bonds, that kind of thing, but it wasn't like life just screeched to a halt so people could talk about the big things that were happening. In the same way, Kawai Koume lived through one of the biggest moments in Japanese history, but experienced it from the perspective of being hundreds of miles from the action, so to speak, frantically trying to put together what was going on based on rumors and half-truths that were filtering out to her through the news. Dr. Partner makes what I think is a very apt comparison because, of course, today we all have at least one pretty good comparison for what it's like to live history in that way. We all remember, of course, the coronavirus pandemic, frantically trying to figure out what's safe, what's okay, what's even happening. Can I get sick from touching things? Yes, no. Can I go to the store? What's allowed? What's not? What's true? What's some insane nonsense some weirdo on social media is pumping out because there's some combination of crazy and desperate for ad revenue? For most people, most of the time, that experience is what the big moments of history were. Things happening at you from far away as you desperately try to figure out what they mean for your ability to do your job, put food on the table, just live your life. So that's what makes Koume's world interesting, in my opinion. It's a window into the lives of women in the samurai class in a way that is fairly rare for most of history, and it's a window into what, for most people, living through interesting times was actually like. But first, of course, we should introduce our subject. Kawai Koume was born on the 27th day of the 12th lunar month of the first year of the Bunka era, or if you are of the Gregorian persuasion, January 22nd, 1805. Which is, of course, a pretty interesting time to be born. Way off in some distant country called France, a wannabe emperor named Napoleon Bonaparte was still in the middle of carrying the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe at gunpoint. In some newfangled country called the United States, which I'm sure will never come up again, Thomas Jefferson had just won a pretty decisive second term as the third president and was a few months away from his inauguration. In the mighty Qing dynasty of China, the reigning emperor Jiaqing was finally coming into his own after his famous father, the Qianlong emperor, had passed away 6 years earlier. The empire, at its height, looked as untouchable as ever. But of course it wasn't, because on the other side of the planet, in England's green and pleasant land, steady industrial improvements in the process of textile weaving, iron smelting, and other industries were quietly but permanently transforming the economic and social life of the country in ways that nobody yet quite realized were eventually going to transform the entire world. But of course, no more than a handful of people in the castle town of Wakayama would have heard about any of this. The occasional oddball scholar with an interest in Dutch studies, as the affairs of the outside world were known, since all knowledge of the outside came into Japan through Dutch texts imported by the Dutch East India Company trade base in Nagasaki. The samurai of Wakayama had far more important concerns. Today, of course, Wakayama City is the capital of the uncreatively named Wakayama Prefecture. But the modern prefecture system of Japan dates to 1871, and the current 47 prefecture divisions date to 1888. Like most of Japan's modern prefectural capitals, Wakayama predates the prefecture it now governs, and when Kawai Koume was born, it was one of the nation's great castle towns, home to a grand fortress from which one of the daimyo, the feudal territorial lords, governed his han, or fiefdom, on behalf of the shoguns of the Tokugawa family. The specific domain in question was known either as Kishu or Ki no Kuni, meaning either the province of Ki or the land of Ki loosely translated. The lords of Kishu, you see, were what are known in the complex status system governing Japanese feudalism as kunimochi daimyo, lords of a province, because unlike most of Japan's other daimyo, their land stretched over the entirety of one of Japan's traditional 60 provinces, in this case, Ki province. Daimyo during this period were ranked according to their domain's assessed economic production in koku, bushels of rice or equivalent rice values. If the domain economy had non-agricultural sectors, it's complicated. What's important for us is that by this metric, Kishu was the fifth wealthiest feudal domain in all of Japan, with an annual valuation of 550,000 koku of rice. Kishu's wealth was matched by its vast size. The old Ki province covered all of what's now Wakayama Prefecture, plus the southern bit of what's now Mie Prefecture. It wrapped around the southern end of the Ki Peninsula, from which it takes its name. The northern part of the province along the inland sea butted up against the great cities of the Kansai area, the commercial hub of Osaka and the cultural and religious center of Nara, and not that much further the imperial court in Kyoto. The eastern side of the province was rugged and mountainous, but still received regular visitors because it was home to two of the nation's most important shrines. First were the Kumano-Sanzan, the three great mountains of Kumano, each with its own respective shrine. Kumano Hayatama, Kumano Nachi, and Kumano Hongu shrines, respectively. Pilgrimages to those sacred mountains date back to Japan's murky prehistory. Second, and much more important, was Ise Shrine, the chief shrine of the sun goddess Amaterasu, whose descendants, so it was claimed, were the emperors of Japan. This connection to the sun goddess and thus the imperial family had made Ise an important pilgrimage destination, a status that endured even as the emperors themselves became somewhat irrelevant, and Ise Shrine, in particular, was one of the territories governed directly by an appointee of the Tokugawa shogun because of its cultural significance. However, the areas right around Ise Shrine, as well as the Kumano shrines, were directly a part of the domain of Kishu. The interior of the province was full of dense forests. This might actually be the etymology of the name Kishu, the land of the forests, but that's a bit disputed. Regardless, lumber was a big part of the domain economy, though like all sectors of the economy that weren't agriculture, there was a whole song and dance required to convert the volume of wealth produced by timber into a rice equivalent for tax purposes. Then, of course, there was the sea, both the inland sea to the west and the wide-open Pacific to the south and east. Fishing and seafood in general were also key sectors of the domain economy. Indeed, Kishu was one of the domains most involved in whaling in the pre-modern period. All in all, we have a domain with a varied economy that, despite being in a kinda remote part of Japan, was very wealthy and had a lot of cultural and strategic importance given how close it was to the Kansai area. So who could be trusted to rule such a place? During the civil wars of the 1500s, the region had been divided between rival samurai clans, as well as powerful temples like Nagoroji, which had substantial landholdings, big armies, and was one of the major centers of gunsmithing. Ki was also home to a great many of the regional ikki, or self-governing leagues. However, in the 1580s, Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded the province and set up one of his retainers, Kawai Shigeharu, in the region, ordering him to build what became Wakayama Castle to hold the area for the House of Toyotomi. Kawai felt some degree of debt to the Toyotomi because of this, and ended up supporting Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, in the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. However, that didn't work out great for the pro-Toyotomi side, and Kawai Shigeharu was forced to give up Ki in exchange for a much less wealthy landholding before dying in disgrace a couple years later. Control of the province ping-ponged around in the unsettled early years of the new Tokugawa shogunate, before the second shogun, Tokugawa Hidetada, decided such an important holding had to be kept in the family. In 1619, he appointed his younger brother, Tokugawa Yorinobu, as the feudal lord of Kishu, and all the way to the end of feudalism in Japan, the domain would remain in the hands of Yorinobu's branch of the Tokugawa family. Now, this meant that the daimyo of Kishu were also part of the Gosanke, the three great houses, the major branches of the Tokugawa family outside of the main line of shoguns, and that was a very distinguished role. The members of this elite club had a special designation. They were not just fudai or inner lords, but shimpan, relatives who were trusted to be absolutely loyal to the shogunate. In addition to their trusted role, if the sitting shogun ever failed to produce an heir, one of the Gosanke would provide a replacement, meaning a member of the Kishu Tokugawa family was only ever a couple of miscarriages, unfortunate accidents, or other tragic happenings away from the big seat in the nation's capital of Edo. This had already happened once. The 8th shogun, the reformer Tokugawa Yoshimune, was from the Kishu Tokugawa, and during Kawai Koume's own lifetime it would happen again. This relationship was also a two-way one, If the main Tokugawa line ever had too many extra sons lying around, they would be adopted into the various branch Shimpan families, ensuring a close relationship between the shogun and the wider branches of the Tokugawa clan. When Kawai Koume was born, the domain's ruler was Tokugawa Harutomi, the 10th Tokugawa daimyo of Kishu. Harutomi, born in 1771, had become daimyo in 1789 at the tender age of 18, when his father died tragically young. Despite coming into power fairly young, the sort of thing that doesn't tend to work out great usually, Harutomi proved to be a very competent ruler, at least in some respects. In particular, Harutomi really embraced the Confucian notion that the ideal ruler was an artist and a scholar. He composed poetry, practiced calligraphy, painted, studied philosophy, and actively promoted all of these fields as well. He built several titanic additions to Wakayama Castle, including the famous Yosuyen Gardens. Kawai Koume's own family held their position largely because of Harutomi. You see, in 1791, Harutomi had ordered a massive rebuild and expansion of the Hanko, the domain academy responsible for educating the domain's samurai. Kawai Shunsen, Koume's grandfather, was one of the first teachers hired for this new expansion. That position came with a modest stipend, we'll talk more about that in the future, and a generous family compound. 100 tsubo of land, which is about 330 square meters, or 3,550 square feet, located in the center of the city not far from Wakayama Castle itself. Just to give you a sense of comparison, a family in the crowded non-samurai districts of the city might have 15 to 20 square meters for all of them, unless they were very well-to-do. On average, about 1,000 townsmen would live roughly on the same size of land that might house 8 to 10 families in the samurai neighborhood, just to give you an idea of how different your life could look depending on social class. But even the townspeople had it better than some. Wakayama, like every major castle town, was home to a population of what they called hinin, literally non-persons, though today the less judgmental term burakumin, literally people from outside the town, is generally preferred. This was a population considered tainted by employment, usually through polluting jobs like the handling of corpses, tanning, executions, and the like. This status, in turn, precluded them from living inside the confines of the city and forced them into designated burakumin neighborhoods. In Wakayama's case, these neighborhoods were on the outskirts of the city, Okashima in the city's eastern edge, and Fukiage to the southwest. Between these two neighborhoods, there were an estimated 3,000 official burakumin living in Wakayama when Koume was born. One of the jobs of the burakumin community was actually what they called hiningari, or hinin hunting, for burakumin from outside Wakayama who had illegally migrated to the castle town to look for jobs. In addition to these restrictions on where they could live, burakumin were forbidden from stopping inside the city's shops to shelter from the rain, from drinking sake in bars inside the city, even from praying in Wakayama's temples, or stopping for any reason other than official business inside the city walls. You sometimes see it argued today that burakumin communities actually enjoyed a degree of privilege because they at least had guaranteed employment from all the jobs domains required them to do, and I guess from a certain perspective that's true. Even so, I think calling any part of this a privilege is a little bit of a stretch. The Kawai family compound in particular was in a samurai neighborhood in the north part of Wakayama City, right next to the Kii River, and very close to Saginomori Honganji, a true Pure Land sect Buddhist temple. Shunsen even got a personal retainer paid for by the domain to accompany him on official visits to Wakayama Castle. Now, Kawai Shunsen had radically transformed his family fortunes because actually before him, the Kawai family's main responsibility had been as doctors for the Kyushu Tokugawa family. Shunsen had joined the Kawai household as what's called a muko, an adopted son who married into the family because the previous generation had no adult sons to take on leadership of the Kawai household. It was an unusual position to be in because muko husbands often had a lot less power over their wives in particular than in a traditional marriage. Their wives were usually well aware they were the main legitimator for their husband's position in the adoptive family, And so a common saying went that if you own 3 go of rice bran, which is about 21 ounces, 600 grams, you shouldn't become a muko husband. In other words, if you have any wealth at all, it wasn't worth it. A similar one went, an only daughter can choose among 8 potential husbands. You see, if you had more than one son, adopting them out to another family was much cheaper than setting them up with a branch family of your own clan, which required a lot of startup cash, and so there were always a lot of interested applicants for a muko spot, so to speak. These situations had also become very common by the late Tokugawa period because of falling birth rates and thus fewer opportunities to produce a son. Studies suggest that about 25 to 50% of marriages among samurai families in the early 1800s were muko ones intended to preserve the family line. And the Kawai family in particular had a lot of muko marriages. Kawai Shunsen was a muko husband who actually might not have been a samurai by birth. The record's a little bit unclear, but we know his father was a doctor in what's now Gifu Prefecture. Shunsen had been adopted into the Kawai household specifically to serve as a doctor. That had been the family's hereditary position within Kishu domain, but for unknown reasons, he drifted to Confucian scholarship instead. But I guess he made the right call, because he quickly became very famous as a teacher of Confucian philosophy, which brought him to Tokugawa Harutomi's attention, and so when Harutomi revamped the Domain Academy and was looking for new teachers, well, Shunsen was naturally one of the first names that came up. Shunsen only had one daughter, Tatsuko, and so her husband, Kawai Kanae, was also a muko, and their daughter, Kawai Koume, would in turn also marry a muko husband. Speaking of which, let's get back to Koume herself. Again, she was born by the Western calendar on January 22, 1805, inside the Koume family compound, which, because she would marry a muko husband, she would call home for her entire life. And her mother, Kawai Tetsuko, was the daughter of Kawai Shunsen, who had transformed the family from samurai doctors into samurai scholars. As a result, the Kawai family compound was a center of scholarship within Wakayama. In addition to his work at the domain school, Kawai Shunsen also ran a private academy outside of his home. That's actually what had brought him to the attention of Tokugawa Harutomi. So the family's space would have been constantly full of students coming and going. The sound of Shunsen leading the 4 basic phases of Tokugawa education would have been constant. Those phases, more or less systematized by the time Koume was born, were Sudoku, the rote memorization and recitation of texts, followed by Koshaku, or lecture, a teacher like Shunsen doing line-by-line interpretations or commentaries on a text. Often among the more modern-minded teachers, those lectures could be followed by question and answer sessions, where students were encouraged to interrogate the text. After that, more advanced students would go to kaidoku, or interpretation, where they were essentially broken into smaller seminar groups led by a strong senior student, basically a college TA, responsible for guiding the discussion. And then finally, there was rinko, essentially the equivalent of a debate class, with the teacher present but only responsible for adjudicating rules of decorum, or at the end of a discussion, resolving any outstanding questions. The curriculum of study to call yourself a master of Confucian philosophy was intense. Classes were daily from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., with that first step, the recitation of text, generally getting 4 hours a day of class time every single day. Students were expected, by the time they were teenagers, to be able to recite all of the Confucian classics by heart. Those classics, by the way, would have been the so-called 4 books and 5 classics of the Chinese Neo-Confucian canon, which had been formalized about 800 years earlier by the Chinese scholar Zhu Xi. Some private academies taught slightly different curricula, and that could be pretty controversial. The orthodox set of classics had received the official endorsement of the shogunate, and in 1790 the government in far-off Edo had announced a new rule banning the teaching of any form of Confucianism that diverged from the officially approved Neo-Confucian doctrine. Even so, particularly in remote provinces like Kishu, those rules were hard to enforce, and the discussion of a more non-standard form of Confucianism was not uncommon. In particular, the radical Confucianism of the scholar Wang Yangming and his followers, with their emphasis on absolute moral certainty and the defiance of orders from your superiors in defense of what was right, still had its followers in Wakayama. So what about Koume? Well, here's the thing. Women's education was, to put it mildly, not the best in the 1800s. One of the shogun's senior advisors at the time Koume was born, Matsudaira Sadanobu, had even gone on record saying, "I consider it best for women to be illiterate." When people didn't follow his advice and taught their daughters to read, it was still usually a pretty basic education. Usually reading for women was just seen as a gateway to provide them with moral instruction, in the form of texts like the Onna Daigaku, or Greater Learning for Women, or the Onna Imagawa Himekagami, or Imagawa Letter for Women. Those texts enjoined women to a pretty basic set of virtues: obedience to their fathers, husbands, and should they live long enough, their eventual sons, domesticity and service to the needs of the family, and avoidance of any sort of public role. They did not, in a word, leave much of an opening for women to become educated participants in public life. And yet, despite this, many women did. Koume's own mother, Tatsuko, was an accomplished poet and painter, and an active participant in her father's various intellectual discussions. Indeed, though the record is thin, there's enough that does survive that makes it clear plenty of women did become participants in public life. They were educated. They did not just confine themselves to the domestic obedience called for by orthodox Confucian thinkers. In general, there's a tendency to view the lives of women during this period in a kind of binary light. There's one view that women were, in essence, an oppressed class in a male-dominated society, and from a certain perspective, that is true. There would always be limits based on law and convention to what women could do under the Tokugawa system. It wasn't like Tatsuko, for example, could strike out on her own for a painting apprenticeship and open her own school. It didn't matter how good she was. However, the opposite view, that all restrictions of Tokugawa womanhood were a mask covering up a remarkable degree of independence, is also true-ish. It's true the lives of women were not solely defined by the status of housewife. Again, Koume's own mother Tatsuko was a well-known poet and painter and participant in the intellectual life of the Kawai household. Women could get a pretty wide-ranging education in everything from poetry to philosophy to the arts and literature, but they needed the permission of the men in their lives to do it, and often the way to make those pursuits acceptable was to frame them as serving the needs of your husband or son. Thus, we know that Koume specifically, as befitted her family, got a far better education than most women during the Tokugawa period would have. Koume had private tutors in painting, Nogiwa Hakusetsu, and poetry, Motoori Ohira. Both these men were pretty famous in their own right, and Motoori Ohira in particular, as the unusual family name might clue you in on, was actually the adopted Muko son of none other than Motoori Norinaga, one of the foundational figures of the National Studies, or Kokugaku, philosophical movement. Kokugaku was a sort of literary and cultural and religious movement during the late Tokugawa period that emphasized traditional Japanese identity free of Chinese influence, and as such its practitioners were often quite willing to take on women as students, because for a very long time, Chinese language and poetry had been associated with public service and were thus coded as very masculine. This is also why a lot of the great classical figures of early Japanese literature had been women. Arguably, elite Japanese women had been the ones to invent Japanese literature itself, because Chinese men had largely been imitating what they saw in Imperial China, writing in Chinese. We also know that Koume was versed in the koto, a type of seated harp, and we can tell from her diary she was both very familiar with Chinese characters, where most women wrote entirely or mostly in the phonetic kana script, but she sprinkled in a good helping of the ideographic kanji, and seemed to know enough Chinese literature and philosophy to sprinkle allusions to it into her writing. Like all elite women, so far as we know, she never got formal schooling in either her grandfather's private school or the Domain Academy, but she seems to have been taught a good deal informally, which is, again, not unusual for the daughter of a scholarly family. Koume married pretty young, at 15, to Umemoto Hyozo, a 25-year-old Confucian scholar and samurai. The Umemoto were low-ranking samurai, but up-and-coming. Hyozo's father had been a dolshin, essentially a beat cop, and the lowest rank of the samurai class in Kishu domain, barely above the commoners. However, Umemoto the Elder had distinguished himself, it's not entirely clear to us how, and won full-fledged samurai status, though his family continued to live in the commoner districts of Wakayama, and not the samurai quarters like the Kawai family did. Hyozo's mother, meanwhile, was from a family that had only recently purchased samurai status, which was a thing you could do in many domains that were increasingly cash-strapped and desperate to fundraise. Initially, her family had been merchants, despised in the Confucian social hierarchy for their perceived economic parasitism. It might seem odd to marry your granddaughter, your only child, off to someone who was a samurai, but not a particularly well-off one. But Kawai Shunsen had a few reasons to agree to this marriage. For one, Hyozo had attended his school and distinguished himself and eventually come to the Kawai household as a live-in student and assistant. With no grandson floating around the Kawai household, you know what that means, it's Muko adoption time. And for that, Hyozo's competence, his ability to take on the Kawai family position and protect it, mattered a lot more than his social status. After all, after he was adopted, he would give up his old family name and inherit the Kawai one. This was also a particularly urgent issue because Shunsen himself was getting up in the years. He would turn 60 in 1820, and while he did have an adopted son, Koume's father Kanae, that son was not much younger than he was. The need for a male heir was very important for samurai families in particular, because if they ever didn't have one, their hereditary position within the domain government, and with it the pay that kept them afloat financially, would be stripped away. But the match wasn't just a practical thing. According to Kawai Koume's great-grandson Shiga Yasuharu, who was also the one who edited her diaries for publication, Koume had fallen deeply in love with the scholarly and gentle soul who had come to live with and learn from her grandfather. There was even a bit of Kawai family lore that one of Koume's earliest poems was a love poem written when she got wind that Hyozo might go back to his birth family, because he was their eldest, and initially they were not super on board with giving him up to the Kawai family for adoption. That poem reads, Kimi to nomi koi kogaretsutsu, hezu samimi, ura no tambo de seri nagari. Burning with love for you only, I while away the time cutting seri leaves in the rice fields behind the house. There's one other cute touch that gives some credibility to the love match thing. When he was married to Koume and formally adopted into the Kawai family, Hyozo began using a literary name, which was pretty normal during the Tokugawa period, and part of the reason that everybody has like 10 confusing names. His was Baisho, the place of the plum. Koume's name, of course, meant little plum. And that's pretty cute, and so we should all just stop and say "aw" for a moment. All of this we can document using bits of extant family lore, surviving letters, records from the period, but not from Koume's diary. Kawai Koume got married in 1820, but her diary doesn't start until 17 years after that point, in 1837, or as she would have called it, the 8th year of the Tenpo era. Why the long interval? Well, it's not totally clear. There's no authorial statement, so to speak, at the start of the diary. No, it occurred to me that for this reason I should start recording my daily life. Nor, at least as I've been able to find, was there any sort of obvious inciting incident to point to. Her son was already a few years old by this point, and her husband Hyozo had been head of the Kawai household for almost a decade and a half. And this is one of the challenges about working with a diary. We don't quite know why Koume decided to start writing it. Maybe this was supposed to be a teaching tool for future women of the household to learn how to manage family affairs. Maybe she thought it would be a fun pastime. We don't really know one way or the other. Ultimately, that's one of the main challenges of relying on diaries as a historical source. We are not the intended audience. So what's actually in the diary? Well, we'll get to that next week. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. You can also support the show on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.